Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Good to always come back to Messiah. Fond memories, although not many memories in this building because it wasn't really around till the end of my time there, but always good to be back. I won't waste a lot of time and kind of jump right in, but what I'm going to try to do a little bit is I play around with history. It's not really historical work, but I'm going to sample some history and kind of build on that and then try to make a theological case at the end, particularly as it relates to the church and race. And so the talk is called Recalibrating the Witness of the Church Amid Racialized Violence in America Towards Counterintuitive Solidarity with the Oppressed. I'm going to start with a quote from Jörg Reiger. He says, "In being pushed to the margins of the system, the repressed not only gain an alternative perspective, you see things from the underside that you cannot see from the top, especially the distortions of the system. But they also gain surplus energies and enjoyment that escape the powers that be in a twofold sense." Since graduating college in 2004, I've been directly engaging the church locally and all over the country about racism, the significance of Jesus' reconciliation work, articulated particularly in Ephesians 2:11 through 22, and the call to renounce dominating over other people through the use of power and coercion. Instead, following Jesus, who emptied himself and embodied another way to be human. I've engaged Christian communities that were predominantly black churches, mostly white churches, as well as multiracial churches. And while I have certainly encountered some people that have no interest in tackling any of these issues seriously, that has not been the primary response that I've gotten from people overall. Most people want to be part of the solution. Most people want to contribute constructively to the division that exists. Most people are jumping in honest about what they understand to be the problem and are seeking further understanding. And it is for those particular people that I have always done my work engaging Christian communities. And while that is a great start, I've come to realize that that is not enough. Even with that goal, I've seen the ways in which Christians still continue to be deeply divided, particularly in their perceptions of racism in America, seemingly unable to understand counterpositions. When racial animosity explodes in our country, forcing us to all talk about racism more publicly across the lines that we rarely do, we find ourselves once again face to face with the stark realities that we do not agree on what is going on. One of the challenges that we must begin to talk about in the church is our own socialization that we have received from various communities. Transparency and vulnerability, patience and conversation, grace and careful listening are all important practices in dialoguing on race in the church. And some of what we need to begin to do as part of this conversation is to wrestle with where our opinions were shaped. Despite sometimes how we might think of our own thoughts and perspectives, all our ideas were developed in particular contexts and spaces. We are all socialized in some way because we all have been part of real human communities. Communities shape us because they have cultures which we all participate in as well. These cultures interact and partly shape our values, worldviews, and everyday norms and practices. Our ideas and assumptions don't just drop straight from heaven, nor did we develop them completely on our own, as though we are lone rangers in our intellectual development. No, each of us come from somewhere or multiple contexts and have been shaped by them deeply. Just as important to remember is that our thought has a history that we are building upon. We've received perspectives from all the various people that have touched our lives, and we can choose if we are going to take those things for granted. If we will critically receive them, are we willing to wrestle over and over again with how and what we will keep, what we will discard, and what needs some adjustment. Accepting the reality of being socialized is often much more evident and easier to accept for African Americans and other people of color groups that have had to navigate this country as minorities historically. However, for white Americans and everyone else that is part of the dominant culture in their particular society around the globe, it is normally not as obvious. Someone whose white is dominant is less likely to think about or be conscious of their own socialization. Rather than thinking of one's own life as having a culture or being shaped by a peculiar context, people who constitute the majority of a society are often unconscious of these realities. Many white Americans tend to think that everyone else is cultural or ethnic, but that they are just average Americans or normal. This is especially the case the more segregated one's life is from our pluralistic society, or because one's own culture determines the norm and is thereby preferred in the public square, in local institutions and schools, and in social networks. It's not hard for a person to blindly take for granted the character and uniqueness of their own social formation because they really have to think about it. I can remember many times in which white people actually said to me that they don't have a culture, or that they are just normal Americans. This can lead people into thinking that how they perceive and interpret the world through their eyes is the purely objective and universal perspectives that everyone else should adopt. Not being conscious of one's own cultural socialization can lead to thinking one's perspective is not just a vantage point, but it is the vantage point. Not recognizing that all of humanity has been uniquely socialized quickly turns into assuming, without thoroughly investigating other perspectives, that our way is the right way and hence God's way. In America, often it is assumed matter of fact that the white dominant cultural way is the right way. The culture, values, and norms of the dominant group get translated into automatically being the universally right moral way of life or perspective. What I want to consider now then is how this very act of blindly accepting the dominant cultural view of things, especially as it relates to race, has proven to be very crippling in our conversations on racism in the church. To do so, we must peek in on various historical moments in America's past, leading up to the present, considering how the dominant group in America has been blinded by the ugly realities of the society they were a part of, because of a socialized community hiding its own hand from itself, unable to see the racialized and often ugly violent practices that it was complicit in. As I already stated, it is like clockwork that our country cycles through events after events that sparks outrage over issues of race and racism in America. We have been doing this for centuries. This cycle is not new. The responses to events like these are predictable, as many fall into their default defensive positions because people's perceptions of what happened are equally shaped by their socialization in society as much as it is by the event itself that triggered the conversation. What seems like a slight majority of white Americans tend to deny and dismiss the outcry and experiences of Black Americans, claiming that it is emotionalism and an inability to deal with the facts, if not more denigrating sentiments and dismissals like labeling people race baiters for even daring to have the conversation. It appears that from their vantage point, only white dominant culture is seeing things objectively and clearly. Everyone else, it seems to be argued, is allowing outside influences like media to shape them. On the other hand, white Americans often believe that they are coming with a clean slate and without any bias. At least that is the claim. What many have believed and have been taught by those around them is that America is generally a good, fair, and equal country, especially in relations to race. We have moved beyond the serious racial issues that crippled us long ago. Following that logic, the ongoing outcry of injustice by Black people is a result of media manipulation and race card playing for sympathy. In the end, those from the white majority apparently seem to believe they know and understand daily Black experiences better than Black people know it themselves, even if their lives have no intimate relationship or ongoing experiences in African American communities. That those who deny systemic racism most are actually the most likely to live in self-segregated lives in relational networks, more than white Americans who do recognize the racial inequalities in America, similarly to African Americans, seems to not matter. And I kind of pick up on, that's from Divided by Faith, which is a little older text from the early 21st century, but draws out some of those themes in that sociological work. And there lies the problem. White intuition, perception, assumptions, and experience limited by homogeneous networks in socialized and dominant society is claiming one thing while black experience is claiming an alternative and diverging reality. This epistemological, that's our ways of knowing, divide is an even greater reality in the church than among the rest of society. What are Christians who participate in dominant society to do when their intuition and experience contradicts the experiences and concerns of historically oppressed groups, right? So I'm pressing in on what to do at these moments where there's a divide and we see things differently. In the 17th century, masses of Anglo-Saxon Protestants on American soil bought wholesale into the myth of race as a justification for enslaving African people. Ironically, many Europeans were not wealthy enough to even purchase slaves themselves. In fact, many Europeans at that time in the colonies were themselves indentured servants in no better situation than most Africans initially were. The motivation of wealthy European elites who could actually afford paying for slaves was obvious. They could increase their production and labor while living a more luxurious life. However, what was the motivation for accepting a new racialized and hierarchical order of enslavement of Africans for poor Europeans, for these poor European settlers who wouldn't even be slaveholders themselves? It seems as though part of the reason was simply for the very relative and small psychological status offered, which told them that no matter how hard things got, they could count their blessings that they were not black. That is right, the relative social status of being a part of the newfound white male citizenry proved to be more valuable and more important to many people than linking arms with the people who actually had more in common with them economically and socially at that particular time. The invitation from the elite to participate in the relative psychological gain of white identity and social life outweighed the absolute realities these European men were living with. The small advantage of white identity blurred the reasoning of these men. Of course, not everyone quietly accepted this new social order. Enslaved Africans at that same moment were, of course, well situated to call out these changes that qualified and questioned their humanity. It goes without saying, yet must be said anyway, enslaved Africans knew that they were more than property, no matter what was said or done to them. Now, with 21st century hindsight, we can all look back and agree as Christians that the white Anglo-Saxons got it terribly wrong. Looking back now, it seems clearly obvious that they were socially blinded by their desire for social advantage and superiority by those that actually dominated over their lives. Most American Christians would now easily agree with the African perspective of the time, claiming that they got it right. It may be too obvious of a statement, but it is also worth noting that throughout most of American slave history, the majority of white Americans, having been socialized by the values and perspectives of the majority culture, didn't think we had a racial problem. Let's leap forward a couple centuries to 1857 and the Dred Scott decision at the tail end of the legal chattel slavery era in the United States. Of course, our society has always had strange contradictions. Leading up to the late 19th century, our country had been proclaiming universal ideals for a while that, quote, all men are created equal, right, unquote, while simultaneously engaging in some of the cruelest forms of enslavement against African Americans. Dominant cultures have a way of disguising their own oppressive practices from themselves by covering it over with strong self-proclamations of innocence and benevolence and under veils of universal principles of equality. It was flowing out of that historical context that the supposedly honorable and esteemed Supreme Court of the United States, called to govern by dispensing justice and equality, came to the overwhelming conclusion in a 7-2 decision that black people were not citizens, they would never be. This country wasn't intended for us. America was never really designed for us, they believed, and therefore black people did not have the right to sue for their freedom when moving into free states. Of course, these men were all products of their time and social location, which many people will quickly point out. And I agree with those that make that claim, though I am suspicious of why people want to point that out in regards to slavery, but not for themselves. Being a product of one's time doesn't absolve anyone. We are all people of our time. We all either renew our mind to become transformed or conform to the dominant ideologies that convince us that we are moral despite what is going on around us. We must learn how to think about how their participation in a dominant society that had already been involved in a long history of oppressing black people had blinded them from valuing the humanity of African Americans and that they too were created in the image of God. This decision after the fact has been agreed upon by just about all legal scholars to be one of the most horrific decisions by the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, at that time, while still a boost to the Southern way of life and the larger U.S. slaveholding economy, it was not obvious to most people who benefited from this arrangement that this was such a terrible decision. This went through the official legal process and justice had spoken. White dominant cultural socialization blinded people's moral vision despite folks like Dred Scott and others that offered a counter perspective that was available to be taken seriously in their own time as well. Dred Scott was also a product of his time. Once again, we can look back and agree that black people at that time understood the problem and that the dominant culture's perspective was wrong. Now, that was not the only Supreme Court decision that, as Americans, we can all look back on in the church and agree it was not pleasing to God, especially the God revealed in Jesus Christ. Consider Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 as another example. During a 7-1 decision by our highest court, racial segregation was decisively affirmed as legal and promoting equality. That most white Americans at that time would affirm that decision is not surprising. The court merely reflected the popular sentiments of that time. White Christians were also conformed after the same racial patterns of society, or more truthfully, they were the ones laying down the foundation for such sentiments. The church took up all sorts of segregated life during this time, as black Christians were even made second-class citizens in churches, confined to balconies or behind ropes in their sanctuaries. The history of deep racial division in the church that we know all too well flowed out of white Christians affirming racial segregated life as the divine order of things. Looking back now, most white Americans would at least agree that the court decision was a terrible decision and that such legalized segregation should not have been promoted the way it was by white Christians. While most white Christians reflected the common sentiments of their time, black Christians differed at this time as well and continuously prophetically called these realities out. White Christians had other Christian voices that they could have opened themselves up to at that time, but chose not to. Jump forward to the racial unrest of the mid-20th century, which climaxed during the Civil Rights Movement. Most of us can still recount the pictures and video from the old black and white footage of black schoolboys and girls being hosed down against walls and sliding down the street, and of the dogs set loose on them by the police during the Birmingham demonstrations of 1963. Or maybe your mind conjures up the vivid images of Bloody Sunday in Selma, where peaceful black, mostly Christian marchers were violently attacked by state troopers and beat senselessly. Most American Christians can at least look back at that time and say that racism was a huge problem in the mid-20th century because, lynching black people was still very prevalent, as well as many black people were prevented from voting, and white supremacist segregation was the law of the land. Guess what? When polled in May 1946, about 7 out of 10 white Americans surveyed believe that, quote, Negroes in the United States are being treated fairly, unquote. Yes, you heard that right. In the midst of Jim Crow segregation, the terror of the KKK and the White Citizens Council, openly tormenting, intimidating black people, and the regular violence against black people in America having no protection or judicial recourse, most white Americans, yes, Christians too, did not think there was a racial problem in our society. That almost 7 out of 10 white Americans could think that black people were being treated fairly at this moment, at such a time of unrest and suffering that we are all very familiar with, questions the capacity to which any dominant cultural group as a collective is able to self-critically discern any oppressive moments with even a little objectivity. Of course, the majority of the black community knew that they were being treated unfairly at this time. In fact, many black Christian leaders were simultaneously attempting to lead the way towards, as King called it, beloved community. That so many from the dominant group in the midst of racial segregation and oppression could convince themselves that things were fine and equal for all at such a time as this must be seriously wrestled with for its significance in understanding dominant group intuitions and social assumptions. What I've briefly tried to do so far is highlight the dominant culture's failed intuitions arising out of a socialization that claimed equality and justice at every stage, while also blinding itself from its own oppressive practices and the perspectives of oppressed groups. I want to state an obvious interpretation of this social phenomenon that we have observed in our past, and then suggest a Christian practice that provides a solution that recalibrates the witness of the church towards a more faithful trajectory. First, however, we need to acknowledge that most white Americans, and Christians included, have been blinded to the racism and oppression that has been so prevalent on this soil for the first 350 years since Jamestown began. I believe that most of the church, whether white or people of color, can now agree with general consensus that from 1619 to the mid-20th century, the majority of white Christians, as a part of the dominant group in our society, consistently interpreted things wrong in regards to racism. The belief that America was a place of justice and equality as an idea covered up the actual on-the-ground experiences of anti-black violence and oppression in a way that veiled most people in dominant culture from seeing clearly. Dominant culture as a social location was actually the worst vantage point for deciphering what was going on. That dominant society's intuitions were impaired at that time is a given today. Almost everyone, except for the very fringe of society, will agree that the majority of white people got it wrong. As racism mutated and took on different forms in different eras, slavery, Jim Crow, all the way to the present, each adaptation proved to be just as deceptive for those in the dominant group. Not because of their race, but because of their social networks and social location and their actual socialization. What we are considering now is the implications of 350 years of those within the dominant society to be blind to racism in their own time. The dominant group has been unable to recognize, see, or know racial injustice in America because their socialized intuitions blinded them from seeing the concrete realities. So why does this matter, right? Why does this matter? Well, as I mentioned, polls continually demonstrate that race tends to be a decisive factor in interpreting current highly charged racial moments in our country. In many ways, very little has changed in relation to our inability to agree on what is happening in the present. Likewise, I have seen online and in person many people interpret what is going on from the social position of dominant culture, and they have quickly dismissed the experiences of racism in American society being expressed by Black Americans. Their own experience and intuition continues to tell them that race is not a significant factor in this country. We must, however, keep history in perspective as we consider current perspectives on racism, so that we don't merely just repeat history in an ongoing and unbroken cycle. Given our history, should we really consider it logical to believe that people who were advantaged socially, economically, politically, and for some psychologically, from some just psychologically, from the racial system have repeatedly been intuitively wrong for 350 years, have now suddenly gained an advantage in interpreting these moments over those who have historically been oppressed? Even more implausible is to believe that at the exact moment that those in the dominant culture somehow finally and suddenly got their interpretation of events corrected collectively, that simultaneously the majority of Black people who have been right about their own experiences for the last 350 years also instantly and at the same time lost their ability to interpret their own experiences. Is it more likely that unexpectedly and randomly the white dominant group and the Black marginalized group instantaneously swapped roles in perceiving injustice precisely during our generation? Or is it more plausible to believe that dominant culture remains a limited vantage point for determining what is happening today? To affirm that suddenly white people got it right and that simultaneously black people lost their capacity to interpret their own experiences as a community seems to be an unhelpful, intuitive response not based on serious reflection of our past, nor on the current counter-testimonies from African Americans in our present. Even John Howard Yoder, a theologian who himself has failed to embody the very peace he proclaims, could at least see, again, even if he didn't practice it, that those at the bottom who are most vulnerable in society actually have an, quote, an epistemological advantage, unquote. That is, they can now know what is real and what they know to be reality is closer to the real thing than the perceptions of those in dominant social position. In his words, this phrasing points us to the awareness that the first question is not who should be fed or who should govern, but whose picture of things is correct. We speak of an epistemological advantage. To see things from below is a truer way to see things as they are. In light of the ongoing concerns around systemic racial oppression and violence, some have seemed to think that since our judicial system has made verdicts, which usually are in full agreement with dominant culture, that justice has spoken and the discussion should be over. This flows out of a naive assumption that our legal system actually is the source that dispenses justice rather than God. Black people, however, know that a verdict and the true reality often do not coincide. Jesus' own experience of being arrested at night, put through an unfair trial, and then given a state-sanctioned execution by way of crucifixion should be the interpretive key for Christians to understand that the inability of empires to dispense true justice. Yoder articulates this point as well. Quote, "We are still part of the generation that believes that the wicked won't really prosper, at least not for long, at least not if we do our job right. We believe that some of the people in power in Washington, D.C. are on the side of the good. Some of the oppressors' hearts can be touched, and some people will give in a little, if just to get us off their sidewalks. That the wicked really prosper is a piece of world history and a part of the Old Testament witness and a part of the Jewish and black experience that we have not learned to take with deep seriousness in North America," unquote. What we are moving towards as a solution is completely counterintuitive. To break the cycle of blindness to racism and faulty intuition, dominant groups must learn to not trust their own gut that has been socialized outside of the life experiences of marginalized groups. Instead, they must follow our Lord Jesus Christ, who in his own day stood in solidarity with Samaritan outcasts, vulnerable women, the hungry poor, and the socially rejected. Those on the margins or in the cracks of society often found themselves intimately sharing life with God in the form of Jesus Christ, who chose to especially identify himself with such rejected people. Jesus did so to the point that he himself became, quote, the stone that the builders rejected. 1 John 2:6 simply reminds us of the New Testament challenge to follow after Jesus, how he lived as for his disciples. In 1 John, we are challenged to live as Jesus lived. In following Jesus' footsteps, we have a new pattern that can help us break out of the cycle that leads to blinders around racism and faulty intuitions. Those in dominant culture are now free to commune with oppressed people and to learn from them, from that community, how to see a truer social reality, one that reflects something closer to the vantage point of our crucified Christ. The challenge here is to trust the intuition of oppressed people over against one's own gut and experience, which has proven to lead dominant groups astray when operating unknowingly out of their social formation. White Christians then must do something seemingly absurd and unnatural, yet very Christian in orientation. They must move decisively towards a counterintuitive solidarity with those on the margins, while allowing the eyes of the violated of the land to lead and guide them as one seeks to have renewed minds no longer conform to the patterns of this world. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the famous Christian theologian and author of classic texts like Discipleship and Life Together, also eventually learned this very reality himself before he penned such great works that eventually were praised as devotional masterpieces ever since. In 1906, Dietrich was born to a very elite and wealthy family in Germany. He had a silver spoon in his mouth growing up. After getting his doctorate at an early age, he decided to get more education just for the fun of it. And so he came to the U.S. to study at Union Theological Seminary in New York City during the school year of 1929 to 1930. Initially, he was disappointed by the weak theology in American liberal churches and institutions. However, through a black friend he made at that time, Franklin Fisher, Bonhoeffer was introduced to both the black community and the black church in Harlem. Bonhoeffer, a white German elite, found himself fully captivated by Harlem black life and Abyssinian Baptist Church. It transformed and reoriented his entire life. There he was exposed to Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Sr.'s prophetic and justice-filled black preaching. He read Harlem Renaissance writers, advocated for the black boys who had experienced an unjust trial in the Scottsboro case, and he even knew firsthand what it was like to get denied service at a restaurant while with his black friends. He came to love the Negro spirituals and would later teach them to his own students back in Germany. Bonhoeffer's experiences with the black church gave him new eyes, and so when he returned back to Germany and Hitler came to rise in 1933, he was one of the earliest and few Christian theologians to speak out against it, particularly in relation to what was happening to the Jews. He had developed eyes to see in a way he never would have before. Many of his theological positions shifted almost completely opposite to what he believed prior to his New York visit, including the significance of the Sermon on the Mount and discipleship for Christian life. Bonhoeffer had learned to see Jesus anew and to understand what was going on in his society by following Christ into solidarity with the oppressed, whether black Christians in America or Jews in Germany. This counterintuitive solidarity gave him new eyes to see and evaluate the world. Bonhoeffer would eventually be arrested by the Nazi regime and was hung in the concentration camp in 1945. However, right before he had been captured, he wrote these profound words. This is what he said. "It remains an experience of incomparable value that we have for once learned to see the great events of world history from below, from the perspective of the outcasts, the suspects, the maltreated, the powerless, the oppressed and reviled. In short, from the perspective of the suffering. If only during this time bitterness and envy have not corroded the heart, that we come to see matters great and small, happiness and misfortune, strength and weakness with new eyes, that our sense for greatness, humanness, justice, and mercy has grown clearer, freer, more incorruptible, that we learn indeed that personal suffering is a more useful key, a more fruitful principle than personal happiness for exploring the meaning of the world in contemplation and action," unquote. So this call to not go with your gut, right, to go into counterintuitive solidarity and towards an intimate, transformative relational solidarity with the historically marginalized and oppressed people of society, learning to see again through oppressed people's perception of things rather than through one's own is not easy. However, I believe that Jesus' own emptying of himself and taking on the form of a slave models for us the way forward. Jesus' own life of identification with the marginalized of society is a call to discipleship and imitation to the same Jesus that is alive and still leading his followers alongside the oppressed of our day. It is the cure for dominant cultural blinders that leaves people's own intuition and vision impaired and unreliable. The Spirit of Jesus Christ is drawing all of us to see things from below, because that is where God has chosen to especially move, work, and transform the world. Thank you. And so I would hope that we could have a little Q&A and a little discussion. So I don't know, maybe I'll give you how about we do this? Take 1 minute, talk to your neighbor about what you heard, and then we'll jump in with some Q&A and think about some questions.
And then
This is so easy for us to
like this. All have different actions.
Like so.
Clearly, there's something off. Yes.
All right, so let's jump into some Q&A. Any questions, comments, clarifications, points you liked, something that maybe you didn't like, anything is open for game. Let's have a conversation. Just raise your hands. Go. Yes.
I really liked your point that you made about how for the first 350 years or so of our culture, the white culture was suppressing everyone else. And when we finally admitted that we were wrong, then suddenly we thought that we knew exactly how they thought. I think we see that a lot today with the whole Ferguson stuff, the Eric Garner case up in New York. We still see that. I come from a very almost completely white community, and so people are, they think they know how everything works. They think that, people are wrong for rioting or being upset. So I guess my question would be, how do we change those mindsets? But you talked about that a little bit, seeing things from below, but how do we get people who aren't willing to do that to see things differently?
Yeah, that's the thing I'm wrestling with all the time. I have no magic answers to that. I mean, I do think that people, and there's various touch points and various ways that we can enter in, but I think at some point people have to desire to want to hear and understand other perspectives, and not just from an individual, because I think the challenge is, this is some of the challenges that I've seen, is that people are quick to maybe find like one individual, like, well, this black person said X, Y, Z, right? And usually a black person that agrees with their position, rather than trying to understand a community. What is this community wrestling with, and what is this community seeing? And I think when you enter into a community and begin to understand diverse voices and perspectives, because obviously you take any black person, you're going to have a whole mix of stuff. But what are you learning from a community? You immerse yourselves, whether it starts with reading or engaging, having conversations, or visiting a church or whatever. I think there's so many different touch points that we can begin getting into that. But I think people need to, in some way, open themselves up to hear and to receive from another perspective. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Just curious, how would you respond to people who say that black Christianity itself is a result of oppression, having been forced onto people by the white slaveholders?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, black Christianity was birthed in the context of oppression. I guess, so for me, I mean, I think that's the obvious thing. I think what is not so obvious, which is the flip that we don't talk about, right, which is white Christianity, right? So we call it, what does it mean to have a Christianity that was birthed, white American Christianity is birthed in the context of either directly oppressing or being complicit in accommodating oppression. What does that mean? I think that's the question. I think it's obvious that black Christianity was born out of slavery and Jim Crow and all. I mean that. So I think what we don't always want to acknowledge is the other side of the coin. What does that mean, and what accommodations were made, and how do we rectify some of those things? That's, I think, what we need to be struggling with. Yeah.
How do we acknowledge, I guess, racial divide without implicitly encouraging. Like, even talking about the difference between white Christianity and black Christianity, there's certain, like, there isn't. It's different, you know, but how can we start to bring those divides apart even in just our verbiage?
Yeah, I mean, so I think there's different theories. I don't think you can do it by avoiding, like I think for the past 400 years, the typical mindset is that we need to just speak more generally and use language that's unifying. But I think the problem is it misses what's actually going on the ground when you just, so I think we have to be able to be very specific and concrete about what's going on. The very thing I think that we haven't been doing, right? I think the temptation is to only use this unifying language. Oh, we're all Christians. Hey, you know, there's no black church. There's no white church. Like, yeah, right. No, there is a black church and there's a white church. So when we can speak truthfully, I mean, I think that as Christians, that's, you know, how do we speak truthfully about the way things are? Not saying that that's the way things should be. We keep a trajectory of what we're called towards, right? And we're marching towards that. But we also have to be very honest and truthful about the way things are. And I think if we can actually come together and actually speak truthfully and share our stories and our experiences, and grow out of a place of honesty and transparency, I think that is our hope. Is that's what's going to be transformative, and that's what's going to be healing and restorative in the long run. Yeah. Yes.
So you stated that we're a product of our time.
Yes.
So how is it that that people have broken out of that mold in the past? Because I think we could definitely learn a lot from that example.
Yeah, I mean, so I think, that's kind of why I kind of had D.G. Bonhoeffer there at the end. He's just one of so many people, right? But, you could almost say it seems like it's an accident for him. I heard someone say, who was it, J. Cameron Carter, he says, the way he imagines Bonhoeffer going to Harlem initially is probably like trying to observe and from a distance kind of scholarly perspective, what's going on in the Negro church, it's 1929. And then all of a sudden he's like captivated and trying to keep up with everything that's going on there that he doesn't really fully understand. And so I don't know if there's any one route, you know what I mean? Again, I think it's being able to place ourselves in positions where we're open to receive the gift of others. And I think, sometimes it's very easy to kind of be in this in-group, out-group mentality where, we set ourselves up against this group in a way, stigmatized, and we've got it all together and they don't, right? And once we get into that mindset, you immediately close off the opportunity of receiving that other person as a gift that might actually enrich your own lives. I think so. Staying open in that sense, I think, is half of it. That vulnerability to receive.
Yes.
Kind of a biographical question, a personal question.
Yeah.
And it's for you. I'm listening to this and I'm trying to wonder, okay, so the theological roots for you, from the humanities, from the social sciences, what has fueled you? How do those things come together? Where did that happen well for you? Because, as a sociologist, I'm listening to this and thinking, oh yeah, that's the need for every student to encounter sociology of knowledge, sociology of power. That's where we need to give more attention to issues of status and privilege and how those things are. But then I step back and think, well, it doesn't have to be through the social sciences. That happens, fueled by theology, fueled by the humanities too. How about for you?
It's a mix of life experiences. I often joke about, I kind of talk about the different community that shaped me. I grew up in this place, Norristown, Pennsylvania. It's racially diverse, black, white, Hispanic, and I was kind of just an average kid there, right? Well, right before 10th grade, our family had a fire, and we ended up moving to the suburbs for 10th and 12th grade. So I had these 3 years And I was like terrified before going. I was like, oh no, I'm the black kid going to this huge white school in the suburbs. I'm going to pick on the black kid, which wasn't the case at all. It was like I got there, and I was a normal kid, average kid in Norristown. And all of a sudden, I got there and I was like, cool, right? All of a sudden, my body, the same person, but I go to the basketball court. I'm the first one picked. They never even see me play. I'm like, trying to figure out what's going on, trying to make sense of that experience. But then again, also coming to Messiah College, and I had a very different experience there as well. I'm thinking like, all right, I was a minority already, now here are my Christian brothers and sisters, this is going to be easy. And boy, was I in for a rude awakening. That was actually way more challenging. And I found that people were responding to me much more as a threat, as a thug, right? As this kind of threatening figure to be careful of here on Messiah campus. And so once again, from normal to cool to like this thug figure, I was a Bible study major. I didn't understand what was going on. And again, it was the same person, but these different spaces. And so beginning to pick up and learn like something's going on here. So it's experiences, it's reading, it's school. Certainly, I certainly do the theological, but I'm very serious about at least engaging history and critical race theory and sociology. And I think we need all of these things together. You can't really address one without the other. Yeah.
Drew, I'm really interested in this idea that intuition, that white intuition, dominant culture intuition, has been wrong and remains wrong. And it's so interesting to think about the difference between the word intuition, and I think white people are getting accustomed to hearing that our assumptions are wrong, our worldview might be wrong. But this idea of intuition, like this thing that we think of as this natural response, that's constructed, that's like a product of these communities and dominant culture we've been part of. So I'm just curious, how are you finding white audiences responding to that idea that our intuition might be wrong? Are we ready to hear it in a way that we weren't 2 years ago,
Right.
10 years ago?
I think some people. I think younger people tend to be a little bit more ready to hear that. But I think it just varies. It just depends on where you're at and what you're seeing and what you're experiencing yourself. I think that is probably the key factor in terms of being ready to wrestle with, our very intuitions being socialized. And so, I have conversations and somebody will, stop playing the race card. I'm like, I haven't heard that one before. It's like these intuitions, just natural intuitive responses for how to respond, well, talking about race is going to make the problem worse, right? Like, no, that's not thought through, but it's an intuitive response that people have. And so we have to investigate, where are we getting these intuitive responses from, right? So everyone thinks like they're just thinking like creatively on the spot. No, these things are being passed around in white dominant cultural spaces. And so we're being taught things and catching this stuff without even necessarily realizing it. And I think there are a lot of folks who are ready to wrestle with, where are we being socialized and how are intuitions itself being shaped. And I think that is a good starting place for us to wrestle with, even how do we perceive these different moments, because it is so much, it's very intuitive, everybody, and that's black people as well. It's a very intuitive response, but it's been a very intuitive response based on a history of actually experiencing the oppression, right? And so how do we wrestle with those kind of things as well? And not to say that intuition, we should just disregard it altogether, but we have to be very conscious and critical of what's shaping us as well. Yeah, I think this,
Good morning. You mentioned it a little bit as you spoke, but I want to know your answer. Why should we keep talking about race?
Why should we keep talking about race? Well, I think as Christians, that would be my starting point, which is why I don't know if you saw towards the tail end, talking about Jesus' own life. At the center of Christian life is following Jesus, right? That our lives are to be shaped after the life of Jesus. that our lives ought to embody and share the story of Jesus every day. And when I read the story of Jesus, I see him in deep solidarity with those who are most oppressed, with those who are broken, those who've been outcasted, those who are stigmatized in their society, his relationship with the Samaritans. Jesus crosses into Samaria, right? And Jesus affirms the Samaritan woman, and certainly his telling the Good Samaritan story would have frustrated his audiences deeply. So there's a way in which Jesus is very aware of how these things play out in society. And I don't understand any way that we can be followers of Jesus and not take that seriously. So I mean, I think that's a part of our discipleship itself. To not be not taking that seriously is to not really be following the living presence of Jesus today in our everyday. I mean, our society is so racialized, beyond more than what we can even imagine. We just are skimming the surface, but it's all areas of our lives. I often say, like, consider, your closest social networks, or those on your library, or the church that you attend. I mean, it's all deeply racialized. We don't think of it like that. We just think I'm just doing normal lives, but we're being racially managed constantly. And so, as Christians who are not supposed to be patterned by this world, and are supposed to be transformed people with renewed minds, we have to be very conscious of what's going on, and hopefully we can begin to be a light rather than part of the darkness. Yes?
How do you respond to people who, well, I guess other social groups who sort of use the Black experience to communicate their own? I mean, like, I've seen other gender, social status, religion. I've seen signs like "women is the new Black."
Right.
I think it's like appropriation or solidarity or both, either.
Probably both, but I think it's a helpful point for anybody that's oppressed, because there's this long history and this rhetoric and language. The Black church, like we said, it was born in the midst of oppression, and the Black experience is, it's not only, but it's largely a story of an oppressed people in America. And there's so many intersections between various, so my experience at Messiah College, this was eye-opening. Like, I grew up in a church that was pretty patriarchal, right? But my experience was that I began to understand some of the issues and struggles that women were having, right? And that they were communicating as well because of my experience as a Black man. And vice versa, that white women I found on campus were particularly a little bit more open to hear, because I think there was some kind of touch points and connections between what we were talking about. And so that experience, though different, was also related to one another. And I think finding solidarity and wanting to find, especially as the church, to be this new humanity that isn't built on any kind of oppression or domination in any form, I think is what we ought to be moving towards. And so I think we have to be both careful with, not quickly, we're the new Black. I don't necessarily like that kind of language, but I do think that it's important to, like, I liked, Muslim Lives Matter, right? That was used after the 3 killings. I think that was good, and I think that it tied in with the Black Lives Matter, but it also allows it to be its own thing, and I think that that making those touch points are important. Good questions, comments? Oh, yeah, great, excellent.
Like the gentleman in back, whose name I don't know who started it all, I was especially impressed with the historical account you gave of, for a little more than 300 years, maybe up to 350, right? the standard story goes, oh, white culture had its intuitions about things, right? Especially its moral intuitions wrong. And then suddenly, magically, sometime in the late 60s, early 70s, right, it just sort of switches on, right? And I take that to heart. I think that's dead on, right? But another point that you made there was the claim of, oh, well, if we're going to break through this, right? Here's some things that need to happen. And one thing that I'm wondering is, well, given the history, what do you think the odds are of, in any clean manner, breaking through? Because, I mean, the attempt to do such a thing predates black culture, predates European culture. I mean, it goes about as far back as human history, right? And so would it not be the case then that it's not so much a matter of just making a clean break on the thing and everybody is suddenly magically, oh, look at us, aren't we better transformed, but that you got to fight it in degrees, and oftentimes small degrees, and accept that sometimes it's going to be small degrees and you have to keep fighting anyway.
And so, in my particular interest is particularly with the church.
Yeah.
So I have very little hope of American dominant culture just all of a sudden, deciding that we're going to take seriously the perspective of. But I do think that we can really think about what does it mean to be the ecclesia, the called out ones, and begin there. And I think that churches can make radical moves, that can at times make radical reorientations when they catch, I mean, it's not immediate, so when I say radical, like these sudden, but that they can begin to move. I've seen, I was just on Wednesday, I was up in this area again at Harrisburg Brethren in Christ Church, because I was there as a youth pastor for 4 years. When I got there, I mean, it was becoming a racially diverse church, but it was a dominant culturally minded church, right? By the time I left, after 4 years, it had drastically changed. And then I went back there, I was speaking on Wednesday night there, and I was like, wow, like this is not even the same church it was, a few years, so I see this church really having gone through a transformation in which it's valuing, affirming, building up indigenous leadership. It's seeing things from a very different vantage point. Probably the sermon that caused trouble for me when I was there, years ago, probably wouldn't even be glanced at. You know what I mean? So I mean, I think that it's possible in the local church, especially as followers of Jesus. I'm hopeful that can actually happen once we take up the call.
That's good to hear,
Yeah.
because I'm kind of a notorious church hopper myself. Right? Been to a lot of them. And in some of them, right, my sense has been that that's right. But I've been to some others where it just seems like, man, you just got to butt your head against the wall.
Right. And to be fair to that point, I mean, I think also, and this is the one, again, this goes back to, the socialization, church, I mean, the white church, we don't like to say it, but it has been at the center historically, this just from a historical point, at the center of the racial problem in America. But we have to admit that first before we can find ways out of that. We have to admit that the church has been not only accommodating but complicit in perpetuating racism, whether it be slavery, whether it be Jim Crow, whether it be all kinds of different phases. We need to wrestle with that, and I think once we admit that, I think then there's a lot of hope for where we can go. But we have to acknowledge that the church has played a early role, and its theology accommodated all of that. And we have to say, what was it? What adaptions did we make that would accommodate lynching, right? Over 5,000 black men, women, and children being lynched after slavery, all the way up through the mid-20th century, right? What would allow us to do that as the church? So, I mean, I think there's acknowledging that has to come before we can find our path out. But I do believe that I'm a firm believer in the work of God and the work of the Holy Spirit and what God can do. All right, I think we're done. But thank you guys.